Well, the roadshow is very important for us because we have a deficit in our budget to finance. As you know, we're spending about 55% of our revenues currently to service debt. And we're trying to do privatization and raise money to fund this year's budget. So there are major challenges. However, I don't see any significant challenges with the roadshow in New York with the DMO because it's part of a program that is pre-existing. The only thing that will happen now is the fact that, as you know, in most of those countries, their interest rates are going up. So now, because of the risk profile of Nigeria with elections and the assumed risk, we probably have to pay more in terms of the pricing is the issue now. So most of these investors are going to ask more for the issue this time around.
So pricing going to be an issue. So, well, for me, it's
not really an issue, but it's going to come at a higher cost.
Higher cost. So, but for me, I'm looking at the budget performance. We're still borrowing money to fund our budget at this time of the year. So it's almost we just started Q4 already, and this is coming in. What's your thought on the fiscal side of things? You know, how the government has been driving that, and ready to fund the budget.
Well, the challenges of this government really has been on the fiscal side. And their inability to fund the fiscal deficit. The challenges with passing the budget, as you know, the budget was only passed in June, and the inability to implement the capital aspect of this budget has begun to see economic growth begin to dip. So economic growth right now is on a downward trajectory, so we've gone from about 2.1 Q4 last year, now we're down to about 1.5. And if we're not very careful, by first quarter next year, Nigeria will go into another recession. So the inability of the government to fund and implement the budget is already beginning to impact the economy in terms of failing to provide the necessary stimulus that will give us economic growth. And added to that, because our economy has not been growing at the rate of our population, which is 3%, our economy has been growing less than 3%, we are now the global poverty capital. So government really has some challenges on the fiscal side, not only with debt service, but also with budget implementation and providing the necessary capital expenditure stimulus.
So interesting. You're predicting a recession in Q1 already, as you say. The IMF will come out in a couple of days with the economic outlook. I will see what figures we're going to see for their projections going forward. But I'd like to take you on the political climate, in Nigeria. We just saw the emergence of Atiku Abubakar as the candidate for the main opposition party, the PDP, and we've heard of pockets of announcements, as the deadline approached on Sunday. What would you, as an investor who wants to play in Nigeria, how would you advise that they look at Nigeria in this time when we're seeing all this coming out?
Well, there are two types of investors, and I want to categorize them. They're the ones that do the foreign direct investments, who are more of the long-term investors. They're already here, and I think that they already understand the cycles of election. And what they do at this time of the year is that they slow down on their investment decisions, and they've slowed down on that from last year, waiting to see what happens. Unfortunately, this is not very positive for the country because people are not sure of what policies the next government would be because we have a lot of flip-flop in terms of the policies that we do. So most of these companies who are already embedded are very careful. Now, this does not augur well for the new companies that want to come. So most of the new companies that want to come now also will wait and see until what happens after the elections. And those that are already here will put off their investment or their expansion decisions until after the elections. They find out who comes in and then begin to decide if those policies will be maintained, and they'll adjust accordingly. So unfortunately, most of the businesses plan over a 4-year cycle. And that is one problem with infrastructure here, because infrastructure is long-term. So we can't get infrastructure investment because of the sort of political cycle and the uncertainty around that. Then there's a second leg of the investors you have, who are the portfolio investors. They're already out in terms of anticipating what's happening. So about $5–6 billion has already left, waiting when the elections are over. And if it hasn't left now, I'm sure that by December they're already winding down and then waiting to see what happens so they don't get trapped with foreign exchange issues again. And so once they understand what happens with elections, then the the foreign portfolio investors will start coming back. And of course, as you know, our stock market has not done very well this year. So consequently, most of the portfolio investors are going into treasury bills. And this is a major concern in terms of how we manage our foreign exchange balances. So it's everybody's being very cautious at the moment.
I understand you've done some advisory work for the government. If you were to speak to them right now, how would you advise them to get investors in or get more people in this market?
Well, the first thing we have to do is there has to be a consistency in policy. We have to be able to convince the infrastructure investors, who are the long-term investors, that whatever we go through a political cycle of every 4 years, it's not going to change our fundamental economic policy, especially as it pertains long-term investments. If you cannot give those investors that confidence, then there becomes a problem. I will tell you an example of a large Japanese auto manufacturer that wants to set up an assembly plant in Nigeria. And one of the biggest problems is the fact that we do not have an automobile act or a law that supports automobile investment in this country. And they're saying quite clearly that until they see a law that they can see that supplies an automobile policy, an automobile act, it's difficult for them to make the sort of investments they want to make in this country because it's long term. They don't want to get caught by vagaries of changes in government. So the biggest advice is that we as Nigerians have to have a policy that we know within its sector that we will maintain, and we have to have laws that will support each investment sector so that the long-term investor is certain that if government changes, those policies will be maintained.